and things like mineral exploration, oil and gas, hydroelectric development, quarries, and large-scale wind turbines. Moving a bit further south again, on the right-hand side of the slide, we see the area around Netling Lake, shown in a lighter green color. This area for many years has been identified by several communities in the region as being of great importance to community use and harvesting, as well as different wildlife values that exist. For example, community members from Pengnatung, Iqaluit, and Cape Dorset all highlighted the importance of this area during community consultations. It is, again, included as a limited use designation with year-round restrictions on many activities. I'll note these community areas of interest are not entirely comprehensive or reflective of the full scope of information that has been provided to the Commission directly by communities. There are a few more in other regions that I will skip over at this time, and go to slide 45, which is admittedly challenging to read or interpret, but it's important to recognize that these two maps represent a great deal of information that the Commission has collected from community members. And this information has been incorporated in other parts of the land use plan, including the community areas of interest we just discussed. But all of this information collectively is included in the draft plan as valued components for consideration, again, by project proponents and other regulatory authorities. So on the left-hand side of this slide, this is an attempt to illustrate some indication of the scope of information that's been provided, but I can tell you that there are over 3,000 individual areas included in that map for which the Commission has specific comments on why the community values each particular area. And some of them are at a very fine scale, very precise, and some of them are broader and more general. All of that information the Commission considers to be helpful to project proponents when they're designing their specific projects, and to other regulatory authorities when they conduct any further reviews of the specific project proposals. Including this information in the Nunavut Land Use Plan will ensure that the information provided by community members over the last 15 years is maintained and presented to the relevant parties in the regulatory process, which will hopefully prevent community members from having to endlessly repeat themselves at different consultations in the future as these project proposals are reviewed in their areas. In addition, the right-hand side of this slide shows what we call use and occupancy mapping information. This was collected by our staff members, led by Brian, and including Annie and Tommy, who are translating here today for us, traveling to communities and conducting one-on-one interviews with land users in the community to record very precisely how they have used the land within living memory. As with the other areas we just discussed, this information has generally been considered in the evaluation of different options for each area that's been identified, but is also collectively included in the 2021 draft plan as a valued component, and these different individual point locations can also be summarized for use by project proponents and other regulatory authorities. And currently, this map of information represents over 10,000 individual locations. I'll quickly note on slide 46, the Commission has a mandate and a requirement to engage with the Dene Southlane of northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And as you may know, negotiations are underway for the agreement of rights and interests of the Dene within portions of the southern Kivalliq. Those negotiations are ongoing, and at their conclusion, it's anticipated that our Commission will have 2 alternate Dene Southlane members, similar to the way we have alternate members appointed by Makivik, representing the region of Nunavik. Those areas are included in the draft plan as valued components. On slide 47, we turn to the similar issue, but more relevant to our discussions here today. The areas shown in orange on the left-hand side of this slide are the areas of equal use and occupancy. These, of course, are areas identified under the Nunavut Agreement as being equally used by the Inuit of Nunavut and the Inuit of Nunavik, who are mostly here with us today, and hopefully the remainder will be arriving soon. These areas are within the Nunavut settlement area and within the Nunavut Planning Commission's jurisdiction, but there are structures in place to provide the Inuit of Nunavik to have a role, an important role in the management of these areas, and that includes having our friends here with us today from communities in northern Quebec, as well as Charlie here with us today as part of the Commission. Through our consultations, the Commission identified a wide variety of values on these islands and marine areas, and in previous versions of the draft plan had actually proposed what would be the equivalent of a limited use designation for these areas in recognition of the importance placed on them by community members. However, in response to the 2016 draft plan, there was very little support for including these areas as limited use designations with year-round prohibitions. Notably, the representative organizations of Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, as well as the Makivik Corporation, were strongly opposed to having these designations included in the land use plan. And in consideration of those concerns, the Commission has adjusted the 2021 draft plan to identify the areas as valued components with no specific plan requirements. However, it should be noted that there are instances of land use designations being applied within these areas of equal use and occupancy for other values discussed throughout the plan. I didn't point them out specifically, but there are polar bear denning areas, for example, within the areas of equal use and occupancy. There are walrus haulouts within these areas, designated respectively as conditional use for the polar bear denning and limited use for the walrus haulouts, as well as portions of key migratory bird habitat sites with year-round restrictions, and as well as setback requirements. And additionally, there are also community on-ice travel routes that overlap with these areas of equal use and occupancy. So again, we look forward to hearing from all participants this week on the management of these areas through the draft Nunavut Land Use Plan, and emphasize that the overall areas have been changed from a limited use in 2016 to a valued component in this draft plan, but there are some other overlapping values that have been designated in some cases. The right-hand side of this slide shows what are called unincorporated communities. I'll just mention in passing that these are limited use designations as well, and are only applicable to the communities of Bathurst Inlet and Dumingmaktuk within the Kitikmeot region. These are not outpost camps, for example. They are not fully established municipalities, but are rather considered to be unincorporated communities that do not have government support, for example. Again, that only applies to those two communities in the Kitikmeot, so I'll quickly pass over that. To slide 48, which on the left-hand side shows community drinking water watersheds. I'll note that each community has an approved and implemented community land use plan that applies to all of your communities within municipal boundaries, and they all have measures in place to manage your drinking water supplies. In some cases, which applies to most of the communities gathered here today, the community drinking water supply is entirely contained within your municipal boundary, and your community plan manages land use in those areas. However, some communities, and the community of Pengnatung is a great example, the drinking water is drawn from a river that flows into the community from further up in the mountains. In this case, for that portion of the community's drinking water supply, or the watershed, the area that catches the water that you use for your community's drinking, it goes beyond municipal boundaries where the community itself does not have jurisdiction. So this is a great example of how the Nunavut Land Use Plan can support community planning and community well-being by extending those management approaches to areas outside of your jurisdiction. So as I said, the community of Pang, that is the case. The other communities within this region are entirely contained within the municipal boundary. But I will note for here in the city of Iqaluit, which has had very obvious, prominent concerns with its drinking water supply in the last several years, there has been a secondary drinking water supply that's been identified that does extend beyond your municipal boundary. So that is not included in this current draft. However, the government of Nunavut has provided the Commission with information on the extent of this watershed that goes beyond the city boundaries, and has recommended that this secondary water supply be included as a valued component. So once the record closes, commissioners will be given full consideration to how to incorporate this area into the revised Nunavut Land Use Plan, and we do welcome feedback, in particular from the City of Iqaluit, on their preferred management of this area, again, beyond municipal boundaries. And I should also note that for the areas within municipal boundaries, the draft plan does identify these areas as valued components, so that would be considered by any project proponent or other regulatory authority, and any activities would still need to comply with the approved land use plans of each community. On the right-hand side of this slide, we see priority contaminated sites. So just like heritage rivers or historic sites, this is not meant to reflect the full extent of contaminated or waste sites within the territory. The federal government maintains a detailed inventory of contaminated sites across the territory, and they have done work to remediate, or to assess and remediate many of these locations, and have sort of ratings or rankings assigned to the different contaminated sites that are known across the territory. In the 2021 draft plan, it's been proposed that the Planning Commission identify what are called priority sites that would be particularly harmful to human health and well-being, and include limited use designations for those priority sites of the most concern until they are remediated, and potentially after remediation to also maintain restrictions on some of these areas, including, for example, on landfills and things that could potentially be harmful into the future as well, if inappropriate uses were conducted in those areas. Slide 49 identifies the military facilities. Of course, there are many different facilities and installations across the Arctic, including within Nunavut. You can see very prominently the former dew line or North Warning System sites that span the full width of the territory. There are also other military facilities, including the port now at Nanisivik, as well as further north, things like Alert and Eureka, and different communications facilities linking those two. Across all of these facilities, there's a common concern about other land users impacting on this existing infrastructure and having interference from different types of activities on things like radar installations, as an example. So for these existing military facilities that are outside of municipal boundaries, the Commission has proposed a limited use designation with year-round restrictions on activities that were considered to be incompatible with the infrastructure at these sites. Similar to the drinking water supplies, the Commission has taken the approach of just identifying facilities within municipal boundaries as valued components for consideration. So, for example, in Sanarayak, we know there's a facility within municipal boundaries, and the Commission's land use plan is not proposing to interfere with the existing management framework for the military facility and municipal infrastructure. The last section here in Chapter 4, on the left-hand side, we see alternative energy sources. And at this time, the only alternative energy sources that were considered as part of this planning process were for potential hydroelectric power generation. The Iqaluit Energy Corporation, several years ago, conducted studies of the Iqaluit region generally, as well as options for the city of Iqaluit. One particular location is included in the draft plan for the city of Iqaluit near Janes Inlet, to the south of the city. Previous versions of the draft plan had included designations that would restrict other potential activities in these areas in order to maintain their potential for future development. However, during consultations on the previous 2016 draft plan, again, there was very little support expressed for this approach, and in response, in the 2021 draft plan, the Commission revised their recommendation and included a valued component identification for these sites, including the location at Janes Inlet. So this in no way indicates that these projects will be developed. It just flags these locations as potential opportunities for future development. And lastly, this slide also identifies aerodromes, which is basically a funny word for the area around each community's airport. When this planning process began, not all communities had approved Transport Canada regulations for the management of land uses around the airports. But since that time, all Nunavut communities have had approved regulations to manage this very important issue. And at this time, the draft plan simply identifies these areas as valued components for consideration by proponents and other regulatory authorities, and the existing regulations would apply to any project proposals within these areas around each community's airport.
Before you go on to the next chapter, I'd just like to initially Premier PJ Iqaluit tungasugit ilisakit kay nakamaku tabungan naligyan.
PJ Iqaluit, come to listen to proceedings. Welcome. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jonathan Savoy with the Nunavut Planning Commission, and a warm welcome to the Premier. The next chapter is on the goal of encouraging sustainable economic development. And if you recall, we went through different environmental concerns in protecting and sustaining the environment, then touched on conservation initiatives under Chapter 3, encouraging conservation planning. We then covered areas of importance to communities and community well-being under Chapter 4, building healthier communities. And now we turn to Chapter 5, the important goal of encouraging sustainable economic development. There are 4 different subsections in this chapter, and as with others, we'll go through them in turn. The first subsection is on mineral exploration and production. Throughout the planning process, discussion around economic development has in large part been driven by mineral exploration and production, and many participants in this planning process have emphasized the importance of this industry to the territory and its economic well-being. Through the planning process, the Commission has long sought information on mineral potential within the territory. When the 2021 draft plan was being prepared, the Commission largely relied on information provided by the federal government that was given to us with the title of Areas with Evidence for Mineral Potential. So this was a single layer shown on the left-hand side of this slide in a lighter orange color. It's kind of a presence or absence indicator. So in these lighter orange shaded areas, you can see in large portions of southern Baffin Island, as well as in Sinikiluaq, are identified as areas, again, with evidence for mineral potential. Also shown on this slide are a darker orange color indicating areas with existing mineral rights. I'll note that all of this information was considered for every other individual topic considered in the land use plan. So I mentioned this morning in the options and recommendations document, there's a subsection for each issue on non-renewable resource potential, transportation, and transportation potential as well. So this information, both the areas with evidence for mineral potential and the existing mineral rights, which we'll talk about more in the next chapter, were considered every time the Commission made a recommendation, whether that was for caribou habitat, community areas of interest, or community drinking water supplies. Now, there are no specific designations for any of this mineral exploration and production information, but this generalized layer of areas with evidence for mineral potential is included in the draft plan as another valued component, again for consideration by project proponents and other regulatory authorities. And as I indicated previously, there will be a more extensive discussion on existing mineral rights and the unique approach to managing those areas in Chapter 6, the implementation strategy, that we'll get to shortly. The right-hand side of this slide shows oil and gas exploration and production areas. In this case, there is no known information in the southern Iqaluit region, and the information considered in this subsection is for existing oil and gas significant discovery licenses, and you can see these in blue north of Resolute Bay, for example, in the Sverdrup Basin. In these areas, back in the 70s and 80s, there was drilling and extraction, and some significant discoveries were made. Those rights are still in place, and the draft plan identifies those locations as valued components. The next subsection deals with terrestrial transportation and communication. A number of different approaches were taken in the 2021 draft plan to managing the existing and potential linear infrastructure, which is a term we use to refer to things like all-weather roads or railways or pipelines, things that are long and straight in nature that are on the land. Many of these areas are included as valued components, again flagged as information for project proponents and regulatory authorities, including proposed routing from here in Iqaluit to the Chidliak Diamond Project to the north. However, there are some areas that are included as limited use designations with restrictions on certain activities, including existing and proposed infrastructure associated with the Mary River Project to the north. This was largely carried over from the amended North Baffin Regional Land Use Plan and incorporated into the 2021 Nunavut Land Use Plan. In addition, I'll just mention that in the Iqaluit region, there is a long-standing interest in developing a permanent link between the Iqaluit and northern Manitoba. This potential corridor has been identified in the draft plan as a limited use designation that intends to protect this area for future development of the initiative that the Commission has heard a great deal of support from communities in the region and other participants, as well as, of course, some concern as well. But that is a significant part of how the draft plan has been prepared in the Iqaluit region that I just mentioned in passing. The next subsection is on marine shipping. In this case, what we're showing here on this slide and what is included in the options and recommendations document are draft areas that are being considered through the Northern Marine Transportation Corridor Initiative, being led by Transport Canada, the Coast Guard, and other partners. And this work is ongoing to establish shipping corridors within the marine environment, including within the territory of Nunavut. When this information was provided to the Commission as part of this planning process, the provider made it very clear that this information was in draft form and should not be incorporated directly into the land use plan itself. But the information has been considered throughout the development of the plan. And as I mentioned this morning, in terms of the different types of whale calving areas, this information was relied on to evaluate, again, the non-renewable resource and transportation potential of given areas, and has impacted the form of the land use plan in some ways, but this information is not directly included in the land use plan itself. The final subsection of Chapter 5 is on commercial fishing areas. On the left-hand side, we see in larger gray shaded areas, Arctic char areas of abundance. So this is generalized information that just indicates an increased abundance of Arctic char in the areas, including here around the city of Iqaluit. These areas are all included as valued components in the draft plan for consideration. And the small dots that are included on the left-hand side indicate water bodies that have been evaluated and assessed quotas under the fishery regulations. These dots do not indicate, again, that they are currently being commercially fished or maybe fished in the future, but again, just indicate a potential for commercial fisheries in the areas, and they are also identified as valued components for consideration. On the right-hand side of slide 55, we see a number of different types of turbot fishing areas along the Baffin coast in particular. Many of these areas are identified as valued components, but I would highlight the importance of Cumberland Sound in particular to the community of Pangnatung, which has been discussed throughout this planning process as being particularly important to that community. And in recognition of those comments and concerns, the draft plan is proposing a limited use designation for Cumberland Sound with year-round prohibitions on things like oil and gas, for example. Chapter 6 is the final chapter, and as I previously noted, this is a requirement of the Nunavut Agreement to have a strategy or a plan for how the land use plan itself will be implemented once it is approved. There's a lot of important information in this chapter, and there are a few key topics we wanted to highlight for participants here today before we begin our discussions. The first point is just a reminder again that all of the different land use plan requirements we've discussed would not apply to community land use and harvesting. We really want to emphasize that point. In addition, the land use plan in limited use areas identify specific uses that are proposed to be prohibited or not allowed And I've mentioned multiple times those types of uses, including mineral exploration, oil and gas exploration or development, quarries, or all-weather roads. If a use is not included in that list, then it would be permitted or supported by the land use plan. So if you don't see tourism or scientific research or military exercises listed to conform to the land use plan, provided it met any other plan requirements. Another important detail is that in many of the limited use designations, prohibited or not allowed. But in the definition of linear infrastructure, it does not include seasonal or temporary winter roads. So in some cases, the limited use areas would not allow a permanent all-season road to be constructed, but those areas would allow a winter road to be used to access or supply a particular location. I indicated in Chapter 5 that the subject of existing mineral rights was an important aspect of this draft plan, and there are a few slides here to try and provide an overview of the approach that's being proposed in the current draft plan to deal with this interest. So the first point we want to emphasize is that, of course, mineral exploration and development occurs in stages. So as you know, when exploration companies go out on the land for the first time, they're not able to propose a full-blown operating mine. It takes time and effort to establish the resources that are present and how they may be extracted appropriately. There's a problem that comes up is that when a change is made to a project, or what's called a significant modification, a new review by the Nunavut Planning Commission is required. So in many cases, significant investment has been made by exploration companies in certain properties that are now within the proposed limited use areas in the draft plan that would prohibit their further development. So the Commission recognizes this concern, and in order to support economic development in the territory, the 2021 draft plan proposes that projects with existing mineral rights within limited use areas that would prohibit further mineral exploration would be exempt from any prohibitions when they undergo these significant changes or modifications. So if a company has already begun work and the Nunavut Land Use Plan is approved, this draft is proposing that when they undergo a change or propose a new activity that requires another review by the Planning Commission, it would need to conform to or be supported by the then approved Nunavut Land Use Plan. But the plan itself is proposing that there would be an exemption from that specific requirement of the prohibition within the plan. So this is can be confusing, but it's important to also note that other requirements of the plan would continue to apply. So if there are setback requirements or seasonal restrictions or requirements for polar bear denning, those would continue to apply to these projects that are being modified, but it's just that exemption, that prohibition would not be applied in those specific cases. Now, over the last year and a bit, there have been many questions with this approach, many concerns expressed, and we've had some very helpful discussions with different participants in the meantime. We wanted to clarify here today, and this was issued in a questions and answer document, but we did want to highlight the approach the Commission took to identifying all of these projects with existing mineral rights within limited use areas. The first step was to download all of the mineral rights data from both the Government of Canada as well as from Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated. This information came in the spring of 2021 when the Commission was preparing the current draft plan. The Commission then selected only active projects that had active mineral rights. And we do note that some participants have expressed concern with these selection criteria, and the Commission will be giving full consideration to potentially revising this approach following the close of the record. We next only selected those existing rights that overlap with proposed limited use designations in the 2021 draft plan that would prohibit mineral exploration and development. We then further refined the list by only selecting projects that have been previously reviewed and approved by the Nunavut regulatory system. And we did this by searching through the public registries maintained by the Planning Commission, ourselves, as well as information from the Nunavut Impact Review Board and Nunavut Water Board. Again, this process led to a specific list of projects that were included in Appendix A of the draft plan, and the Commission does appreciate the concerns and comments that have been provided by several participants in how this list was established. Slide 60 shows a simple overview of some of these projects, including their names and the company responsible for them, and an inset map of where these projects occur. Here in the southern Iqaluit region, the primary, if not only, example is the rights associated with De Beers Chidliak project north of Iqaluit that in the 2021 draft plan overlapped with identified caribou habitat that was flagged by the Iqaluit Wildlife Board and included as a limited use designation in the 2021 draft plan. So just to further clarify, the concept is that if and when these projects undergo modifications in the future that would require a new review, Commission staff would review that proposal in these limited use areas against the map in Appendix A to establish that these are continuations of existing projects and would not apply the prohibition on mineral exploration in these areas. So the effect of that is that any project with existing rights, including the Chidliak project, would be able to continue to the rest of the regulatory system in these areas and would not be prevented by the Nunavut Land Use Plan from advancing for further consideration by other regulatory authorities. We're nearing the end here. Thank you for bearing with me. It's important to recognize
Thank you, Jonathan. We can take a break.
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
15-minute coffee break.